Hey guys, listen up. If you're working hard at the gym and you're trying to do the right thing with your diet and you're still just not feeling 100%, things that I often hear guys complain about are that their focus isn't quite where it used to be. Often people feel like they've just sort of lost their edge. These are things that most guys just chalk up to being, I'm getting older. And they accept it. The reality is you don't have to. I think there's sort of two categories of men that I tend to see who come in to me for help. The first one is a group who used to be athletic, often, played high school or college sports, and then were in what they consider to be, good health, and then devoted a lot of time and energy into family and sort of let their weight get a little bit out of hand and now are really feeling the effects of that. Another group is a group of men who have really tried to put some energy into their exercise and diet regimen and just aren't seeing the results that they expected to see or that they used to see in their 20s and early 30s. And the reality is that most guys just tend to accept this and look around and often, look at a peer group and say like, well, I'm doing all right for my peer group. So they just let it ride and chalk it up to age. But the reality is you don't have to accept that. And really for your longevity, you shouldn't. When you look at the causes for this, it boils down to about 5 sort of root cause issues that if you address and fix, you can get back to an optimal state of functioning and feeling really like 100%. And so we're going to dive a little bit into what are these sort of 5 root causes that tend to affect men and are really detrimental for their longevity. So some common symptoms that start almost like, the analogy of the frog, a pot of water that slowly is coming to a boil, that a lot of men gradually experience, either don't even know that they're experiencing them or are just willing to just deny it and chalk it up to age. One of the big ones is focus, concentration, and cognitive function. Name recall starting to fall off. Vocabulary being not quite as, on the tip of the tongue as it used to be. These are common symptoms for, really the beginnings of cognitive decline. Energy and fatigue is another big one. A lot of men are absolutely dependent on caffeine, 4 or 5 cups a day, feel like they need that particularly to get through the early and mid-afternoon where they're often hitting a wall. And even when they are active, are feeling like they can't quite kick it into, 5th gear to get things really going the way they used to. Another area that I see men complain about is motivation. This is tied to sort of that energy and fatigue, but I think is a category in and of itself. But this is associated with everything from work-related motivation, but could also be associated with sex drive and libido. So libido waning, and often with that some degree of erectile dysfunction, is super common, and many men just chalk it up to age and denial. Another issue that I see men just sort of accepting are gut-related issues, bloating, gas, sometimes crampy pain, bowel movements that are either frequent or irregular and loose. Most men just think that it's normal. The reality is it's not. Addressing these things by looking under the hood can really get to the root cause for why you feel this way and can completely reverse many of these symptoms. So I think root cause number 1 that is often overlooked by traditional medicine is hormones. And the reality is that most men hit their peak of hormone levels in their early to mid 30s. So that means by the time you're 35, most men are already at the peak of the hill, so to speak, and are starting to go downhill in terms of their hormone production. Most men focus on testosterone, but testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone are just as important in men as they are in women. Just men need a much higher ratio of testosterone to estrogen and progesterone than women do. So low testosterone is super common. What's often overlooked and missed is looking at and evaluating and supplementing appropriately if needed for DHEA, DHT, progesterone, pregnenolone, and estradiol. What also falls into this bucket are thyroid hormone function and cortisol, because most men are adrenally overstimulated, and indeed most people in our society are adrenally overstimulated. The adrenals are on that downhill slope as well, and the lack of robust production of cortisol and long-term overstimulation of burning the candle at both ends, and that chronic chronic cortisol stimulation leads to a degree of adrenal fatigue. Now, what gets a lot of men and traditional providers hung up are the traditional normals or reference ranges that you find in typical lab work. So for example, Quest, LabCorp, these large lab providers develop reference ranges, and they call them reference ranges specifically. They don't call them normal because they're a reference range, meaning that they're a guidepost for clinicians to then use their judgment to make decisions around treatment. And the issue, particularly with testosterone in men, is that those reference ranges in most labs are epidemiologic. Generally speaking, how labs come up with their reference ranges is they'll take a cohort of recent tests that they've done, plot those on a graph, and what you'll end up with is a bell curve. So if you take a few thousand recent total testosterone levels and put that on a graph, you'll get a bell curve. And then the labs take that bell curve and pick, 90th and 10th or 80th and 20th, or we don't really know, 95th and 5th percentile, and they say everything within this we'll call our reference range. The problem with that is we're not measuring testosterone in healthy 20-year-olds. So the whole reference range is skewed, and this is true to a degree for almost every lab test. The reference range is skewed based on the people who providers are drawing that lab test for. So if you're only looking at testosterone in 40, 50, and 60-year-old men, what's going to happen is that reference range is going to be skewed towards the lower end of testosterone levels. What I would argue is the reference range for most total testosterone levels is far lower than what is optimal for most men. And so to really know what's optimal for you, in an ideal world, we would have historical data showing what our testosterone did pre-puberty, then through puberty, and then through early adulthood, and then through, maturity, to see sort of what are ideal hormone levels. And then we would be able to sort of replicate that, in a hormone therapy treatment plan. But most of us don't have that. So what's important is to know that what your optimal testosterone is and should be is likely to be very, very different from the reference range that most clinicians are seeing when they're looking at a testosterone lab report. So I've seen many, many men said, I've had my testosterone checked and it's normal. And they have testosterone at 300, 400, or even 500 totals, which in my opinion is many of those numbers are well below what I would consider to be an optimal testosterone level for men. So ultimately, what do you do about this? There are a number of different fixes. And the reality is, lifestyle, nutrition, and exercise are crucial. And those can look very different from person to person. And how to know what your ideal diet and exercise regimen should be, particularly as it pertains to hormones, can really be clearly delineated with the appropriate testing. But on top of that, there is a whole range of therapies that can be used to help boost your testosterone levels. And this starts with supplementation. On top of diet and exercise, there's supplementation. So over-the-counter supplements that are easy to get, generally considered safe. Next level would be some form of medication. So there are oral medications that can be used to help stimulate higher testosterone levels. There's then HCG, which is an injectable peptide, which is FDA approved, which can be used to help stimulate testosterone, and then ultimately some form of testosterone replacement. So I think there's a misconception that testosterone therapy is solely testosterone replacement. And the reality is there's a whole range of options for enhancing testosterone levels. And that doesn't require injections, doesn't always require injections, and it doesn't always require full-on testosterone replacement, even though for many men that might be the right thing to do. My point is there's a whole range of options as to how to deal with hormone levels. Root cause number 2 that is often overlooked and not addressed in traditional medicine is sort of a broad bucket, but this includes, metabolism, inflammation, and I would put gut health in this bucket. Now, there's a lot of different topics here, but the reality is as you hit that aging curve and as your hormone production starts declining, a lot of the regenerative and anabolic capacity that you had in early adulthood is starting to diminish. And with that, you get increased generation of free radicals, higher levels of oxidative stress, which acts like a snowball on top of the hormone decline to accelerate the aging process. What happens with that is metabolically, your system becomes way less efficient. There are a lot of other important factors to consider here. So for example, with metabolism in general, I was going to go back to lifestyle, diet and exercise as a core component of an appropriately tailored health plan. But on top of that, supplementation and micronutrient insufficiencies play a large role in men. So for example, things like magnesium, vitamin D, selenium, manganese, among other micronutrients are commonly insufficient in men when we measure them, and helping to support those levels can help enhance metabolic function, which otherwise is going to continue that downward slope and decline. Ultimately, this links into the gut, because where you should be getting those nutrients come from your digestion and absorptive capacity. As you're on this downhill slope, the gut starts to function inappropriately, where most of us suffer from some degree of leaky gut. Our diets and lifestyle contribute to this. When you have leaky gut, this accelerates the decline in the metabolic processes because your absorption of nutrients is suboptimal, and the generation of inflammation that I talked about earlier, much of that occurs in the gut, particularly with some degree of leaky gut. So again, acting like more weight or more bulk on that snowball as it's running downhill. Clearly, to address these issues, getting appropriate micronutrient assessments, appropriately personally tailored supplementation plans, measurement of gut function with gut microbiome, gut, GI mapping, some degree of assessment of the absorptive capacity in the gut can be key to tailoring a plan to help getting your gut back online to functioning properly, digesting and absorbing the things that are essential for your body to function well into your late decades. The third sort of root cause or bucket that I think about when it comes to men's health comes down to nervous system function. So we could think of this as brain function, neurologically, cognitive function. We could put in here some degree of emotional function and resilience. Symptoms that men often complain about, I mentioned some earlier on, but cognitive function in terms of how sharp or how quick you feel mentally, name recognition, vocabulary recall, but also could manifest as mind racing, particularly at night, and sometimes cognitive crashes or even energy crashes that tend to happen mid or early afternoon. Why does this happen? Many of the factors that I mentioned before, decline in hormone production, the metabolic inflammatory declines that I mentioned in sort of the prior two root causes, significantly affect the cognitive and the brain function. But what is super common in our society is dopamine and adrenergic overstimulation. We live in a society where we get success from driving ourselves hard, burning the candle at both ends. And this is a lesson we learn early in school and in life. We get success that way. And so many of us are stuck in a sympathetic nervous system state of functioning where we're constantly turned on, to the point where sometimes the nervous system even forgets or doesn't even know how to ramp down or turn off. The term there would be to activate the parasympathetic function of your autonomic nervous system. So that dopamine overstimulation and the adrenergic overstimulation is another factor that drives burnout in the cognitive and neurological space. This can actually be measured, and there are hard clinical therapeutics that can be used to help your brain shift out of this parasympathetic and dopamine overdrive. A whole host of tools, again, going back to diet and lifestyle as the core to any good personally tailored longevity plan. Fasting is a key component. Driving your body into a starvation state can be highly beneficial for a number of different reasons, but especially for cognitive function. And then we could even get into discussing like dopamine fasting, where you are providing that we are, subjected to and subject ourselves to on a daily basis. This can enhance neuronal plasticity. This can enhance cognitive resilience. Additional tools that could be brought to bear include breath work, proper neuro enhancing and supporting peptides. And then I would argue biologic therapies like stem cells and exosomes, I believe, have a role in this space to help stimulate healing in neurologic tissues. The fourth root cause really comes down to more an emotional and or even spiritual basis for wellness. What's important and often missing here, many people are now more aware, gratitude journaling, mindfulness, and meditation are becoming more and more, at least there's more and more awareness around these modalities that can be beneficial. But for me personally, I think that misses a key component for emotional and personal well-being in men. And I agree with Jordan Peterson on this, in that I think all men, and perhaps all people to a certain degree, have a demon inside us. It could be a devil, could be a monster. I think this is something that men in particular in our society have trouble embracing in a positive, constructive way. And I think if you think about this from an evolutionary perspective, that there was a component of necessity here, that there are times for safety and protection of the family and the home that you need to access the monster. And in our current society, we're extremely fortunate in that most of us don't have a need to access that really at all or in a meaningful way over a course of a lifetime. And so, in my opinion, what that leads to is a buildup of this energy that doesn't have a healthy way to release. And so I think for true emotional wellness and true health in men, you have to find a way, in a healthy, constructive, positive way, release the monster. And for me personally, I find that in combat sports. I was very young. I was drawn to wrestling. At that age, it wasn't the picture of athleticism that you would think would be drawn or have an aptitude for combat sports. But for me, that enables the release of that energy in a healthy, constructive way when done properly with other consenting adults who are also engaged in similar activities, talking about, embracing, and finding a way to constructively release the monster inside of you enables you to then turn around and embrace the gratitude, forgiveness, love, compassion, and empathy. And so for me personally, what I find is this approach of just trying to address, identify, and express the empathy, love, gratitude, forgiveness completely ignores that other form of energy that needs to be released. So if you want to have true long-term health, if you want to have true longevity in your life, I would encourage you to find a way to release the monster. This could be done through running. This could be done through rock climbing. It doesn't have to be a physical engagement or activity, although I personally feel that I would encourage you to find a way to physically engage that side of yourself. It could be through art. It could be through music. It could be through writing. So everybody has a different way that energy can be channeled in a constructive fashion. But I don't think you can talk about men's mental, cognitive, and emotional health and spiritual health without addressing this component of ourselves. Because I guarantee you, if you do that, you'll be able to approach your family, your profession, and the community around you in a much more positive, beneficial way. That being said, the core I'm going to come back to, which you'll hear me repeat again and again and again, is that being grounded in a way of being and a way of existing that embraces love, empathy, gratitude, forgiveness, and compassion is the true pathway to actual happy longevity. So in men, I don't think it's possible to do that without embracing the demon within. And so the two, it's like a yin and a yang that need to be addressed. And I think, how do you tailor a health plan around this? That's something that's a little bit more than a lab test and a 15-minute consultation. But I think it's absolutely something that needs to be considered in any long-term health or longevity plan. So I guess ultimately, what's the path or what's the fix for all of these issues that men deal with? In my opinion, all of these things can be addressed in a comprehensive longevity plan that does the appropriate assessment, which includes not just a laboratory assessment, which does a full biomarker evaluation, but also includes things less commonly measured, such as hormones, inflammatory markers, toxic exposures, micronutrient levels, gut microbiome, but also includes an appropriate physical evaluation, so strength and movement assessment that incorporates some evaluation of or assessment of your fascial and soft tissues, and to identify areas of restriction and increased mobility and strain, which inevitably, if not addressed, will lead to dysfunction, pain, and disability down the road, but also a plan that incorporates the best of modern medicine and therapeutics, but is not afraid to embrace the alternatives, which include many of which I've mentioned, peptides, cell therapies, among others. And so in my experience, there's 4 main root causes that tend to affect men as they age.